Dorothy Mae Johnson was 94 years old, weighed 91 pounds, and had to be helped to the Family Feud podium by her great-grandson because her left hip had been broken twice, and the VA hospital had denied her a replacement both times. She wore a pale blue church dress she had sewn herself in 1987 and a pair of white shoes her late husband had bought her in 1961. When Steve Harvey asked her the survey question, "Name something a woman keeps hidden from her husband," Dorothy Mae leaned into the microphone, paused for 3 full seconds, and said, "The letter I wrote to the boy I loved before him, the boy who died at Normandy. I never told my husband I kept it in my Bible for 60 years." The studio fell completely silent. 212 audience members sat motionless. Steve Harvey's mouth opened, then closed. His hand came up slowly and covered his face. He turned away from the camera, walked 4 steps toward the judges' table, and stood with his back to the audience for 8 seconds. When he turned around, his eyes were red, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. He said, "Ma'am, that is not on the board, but I don't care." The cue cards were shaking in his hands. The producers were speaking in his earpiece. He pulled the earpiece out, set it on the podium, and said, "We're going to stop the game." It was October 5th, 2024, in the Family Feud studio in Atlanta, Georgia. The Johnson family, Dorothy Mae, her daughter Vivian, her grandson Keith, her great-grandson DeAndre, and her great-granddaughter Nia, stood behind the left podium. Dorothy Mae was the oldest contestant in the history of the show. DeAndre, who was 19 and played point guard at Morehouse College, had pushed her wheelchair to the edge of the stage and then walked her the final 12 steps to the podium with his arm under hers, counting each step out loud the way she had apparently taught him. Across from them stood the Kimura family from Portland, Oregon. 3 sisters, their mother, and their grandmother, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher named Sachiko, who had bowed to Dorothy Mae before the game started and said, "It is an honor to share a stage with you." Dorothy Mae had taken Sachiko's hands and said, "Honey, at my age, it's an honor to share anything." The audience had laughed. The lights were bright, the buzzers were ready, and on the inside pocket of Dorothy Mae's dress, pinned with a safety pin she had fastened that morning in her hotel room while Vivian steadied her hands, was a folded piece of paper so old the creases had worn through to tiny holes. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Dorothy Mae Johnson was born on March 17, 1930, in Greenwood, Mississippi, the youngest of 9 children in a sharecropping family that picked cotton on land they would never own. Her father could not read. Her mother could not write. Dorothy Mae taught herself both by the age of 7 using a Bible her grandmother had carried from Alabama and a Sears Roebuck catalog a neighbor threw away. By the time she was 14, she was the only person in her family who could read a contract, and she discovered that the landowner had been underpaying her father by 40% for 11 years. She showed the numbers to her father. He looked at them, looked at her, and said, "Put that away and don't ever show it to anyone." He was afraid. In Greenwood, Mississippi, in 1944, a black girl who could read a white man's contract was not a source of pride. She was a target. When Dorothy Mae was 16, she fell in love with a boy named James Beaumont. James was 17, the son of a preacher, tall and quiet, with hands that could fix anything mechanical, and a laugh that Dorothy Mae would later say sounded like a screen door in summer. They met at a church picnic in June of 1946. James walked up to her with a plate of food and said, "I brought you this because you looked like you were thinking too hard to remember to eat." She laughed. He sat down. They talked for 4 hours. By September, they had an understanding. Not an engagement because they were too young and too poor, but an understanding. They would wait. James would work. Dorothy May would finish school. And when the time was right, they would build a life together. In February of 1947, James enlisted in the Army. He was 17, and he told Dorothy May he was enlisting because the Army would teach him a trade and pay him enough to rent a house. She knew the real reason. His father's church had burned down. The family had nothing. James needed the enlistment bonus to keep them fed. The night before he left for basic training, he and Dorothy May sat on the porch of her family's house, and he gave her a brass button from his father's old suit jacket. He said, "Hold this until I get back." She put it in her Bible. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. James Beaumont was sent to Fort Benning, then to Germany as part of the post-war occupation force. He wrote Dorothy May 11 letters over 9 months. She wrote him 14. His letters were short, misspelled, full of jokes about army food and drawings of the German countryside he made with a pencil stub. Her letters were longer, full of details about home. Who married whom? Which crops came in? What songs the choirs sang on Sunday? In his 11th letter, dated November 2, 1947, James wrote 5 words at the bottom of the page. "I'm coming home to you." He never came home. On November 19, 1947, 17 days after he wrote that letter, James Beaumont was killed in a training accident at a base in Bavaria. A vehicle rollover. He was 18 years old. The Army sent a telegram to his father. His father walked to the Johnson house and told Dorothy May on the same porch where James had given her the button. She did not scream. She did not cry, not in front of anyone. She stood up, walked inside, went to her room, closed the door, and did not come out for 3 days. When she emerged, she had written a letter to James. She folded it, placed it in her Bible next to the brass button, and never spoke his name again. 2 years later, Dorothy May met Harold Johnson at a cousin's wedding in Memphis. Harold was a mechanic, a Korean War veteran, a man who told stories that made everyone in the room lean forward, and spoke to Dorothy May like she was the most intelligent person he had ever encountered. They married in 1951. They moved to Chicago. Harold worked at a Ford plant. Dorothy May worked as a seamstress, then as a teacher's aide, then earned her teaching certificate at age 41, and taught 3rd grade on the South Side for 22 years. They had 3 children. They were married for 53 years. Harold called her "My May" every single day until the morning of June 14, 2004, when he did not wake up. Dorothy May never told Harold about James. She told herself it was because it didn't matter anymore, because Harold was her life, because the past was the past. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. She was afraid Harold would feel like her second choice. And he wasn't. She loved Harold with everything she had. But she had loved James first, in the way that 16-year-olds love, completely, recklessly, without any understanding that the world could take it away. And she kept James's letter in her Bible for 60 years, tucked behind Psalm 23. And every Sunday when the pastor read that psalm, her fingers would brush the edge of the paper, and she would remember a boy on a porch and a brass button, and a laugh like a screen door. The audience thought that was the peak. They were wrong. In July 2024, DeAndre submitted the Johnson family to Family Feud. He had been trying for 2 years. When the acceptance call came, he ran into Dorothy May's room at the assisted living facility in Chicago, where she had lived since 2019, and said, "Grandma Dot, we're going on TV." She looked at him and said, "Baby, I'm 94. What am I going to do on TV?" He said, "You're going to be yourself. That's enough." What DeAndre did not know, what nobody in the family knew, was that Dorothy May had made a decision. She had been carrying the letter and the brass button for 77 years. She had never told her daughter. She had never told her grandchildren. She had carried the secret through a marriage, 3 children, 11 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren, a career, a migration from Mississippi to Chicago, and 53 years of a love she never once doubted. But she was 94. Her hip was broken. Her hands shook. And she had decided that before she died, someone needed to know about James. She chose Steve Harvey. Not her daughter, not her pastor, not her great-grandson who pushed her wheelchair and counted her steps. She chose a man she had watched on television for 15 years, a man she had never met, because she said later in a hospital interview that aired on CBS, "He talks to people like they matter. I needed someone who would listen like it mattered." Steve would later call what happened next the most important moment of his career. The survey question was simple. Steve read it with his usual grin, his eyebrows raised, his timing perfect. Name something a woman keeps hidden from her husband. The board had answers like shopping receipts, and her real age, and chocolate stash. The audience expected a punchline. Dorothy May leaned forward, and what came out of her mouth turned a game show into a confessional. She told Steve about James, right there, on camera, in front of 212 people and 4 generations of her own family who had never heard the name before. The studio fell completely silent. Vivian, Dorothy May's 71-year-old daughter, gripped the podium. Her face went white. Keith, the grandson, put his hand on his mother's back. DeAndre stood behind Dorothy May with his arms still under hers, and his eyes were so wide, the cameraman would later say he looked like a boy who had just realized his grandmother was a universe he had never explored. Steve walked toward her slowly. His voice was almost gone. "Miss Dorothy," he said, "you carried that letter for 60 years. 77, she corrected him. Her voice was steady. Thin as paper but steady as a floor. 77 years, Steve repeated. He shook his head. And you never told your husband. I loved my husband, Dorothy May said. I loved Harold Johnson every day of my life with him. But I loved a boy before him who didn't get to grow up. And I didn't want Harold to think that loving James meant I loved him less. She paused. It didn't. Love isn't a pie, Mr. Steve. You don't run out of slices. Steve's chin dropped. His hand went to his chest. He turned away for a moment, and when he turned back, his cheeks were wet. A sound technician in the booth pulled off her headphones and pressed her palms against her eyes. 2 cameramen were crying. Nia, the great-granddaughter, a 15-year-old with braids and her grandmother's jaw, stood at the end of the podium with tears running silently down her face. Do you have the letter? Steve asked. Dorothy May reached into the inside pocket of her dress. Her fingers trembled. She pulled out the folded paper, yellowed, soft as cloth, the creases worn into tiny windows, and she held it up. I've never opened it again, she said. I wrote it the day they told me he was gone. I sealed it, and I put it in my Bible, and I never read it again. Do you want to open it now? Steve asked. No, she said. I want you to read it. Steve Harvey took the letter from a 94-year-old woman's shaking hands. He unfolded it on national television. He looked down at the handwriting of a 16-year-old girl from Greenwood, Mississippi, written in pencil on lined paper in 1947. And he read it. He read it slowly. His voice broke 4 times. The letter was 9 sentences long. It said nothing about death, nothing about grief, nothing about the future. It was a letter about a porch, about a brass button, about a boy who brought a plate of food to a girl who was thinking too hard to eat. The last sentence read, "I will carry you in my Bible until I see you again, and I believe I will." The studio fell completely silent. Steve set the letter down on the podium. He did not speak for 10 seconds. Then he looked at Dorothy May and said, very quietly, "Let me tell you something, Miss Dorothy, because I understand carrying something." The studio was so still, the air conditioner's cycling was audible through the microphones. 29 years ago, I made a promise to God. I was living in my car, a 1976 Ford Tempo, showering at gas stations, eating out of trash cans. 3 years in that car, and I promised God that if He let me out of that car, I would spend the rest of my life helping people. I would carry that promise the way you carried that letter. He paused. And I have, every day. Because some things you carry don't weigh you down, Miss Dorothy. They hold you up. Dorothy May reached forward and took Steve's hand. Her fingers were so thin he could feel every bone. She said 5 words that would become the most shared sentence on the internet for the next 6 weeks. Love doesn't run out, baby. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the Kimura family. Sachiko, the 70-year-old grandmother, was weeping. Her 3 granddaughters stood behind her with their arms around each other. Steve said, "Mrs. Kimura, And Sachiko cut him off. "Give it to her," she said. "Give her whatever she needs. My husband was a soldier too." He would insist. Steve nodded. He turned to the audience. "Stop everything!" The overhead speaker crackled. A producer's voice started to say something. Steve held up his hand. "This has never happened in 26 years of this show." He pulled out his phone on stage. He dialed. The call connected through the studio speakers. A woman named Dr. Patricia Hendricks answered, the chief of orthopedic surgery at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. "Dr. Hendricks," Steve said, "I'm standing next to a 94-year-old woman whose hip replacement was denied by the VA twice. Her name is Dorothy May Johnson. She taught 3rd grade for 22 years. She's been carrying a letter in her pocket for 77 years. And she walked 12 steps to get to this podium today because her great-grandson counted every one." Dr. Hendricks's voice came through clear and firm. "Mr. Harvey, you tell Miss Dorothy that my team will take care of her. No charge, no paperwork. We'll see her Monday." Dorothy May looked toward the speakers. She couldn't see Dr. Hendricks, but she nodded, slowly, and her hand tightened on Steve's. But Steve wasn't done. "The Kimura family's prize money, $20,000, goes to the Johnson family," he said. "But my foundation is also establishing a program in Miss Dorothy's name. The Dorothy May Letters Project. We are going to collect and preserve the letters, photographs, and personal items of families who lost loved ones in military service, so that no one ever has to carry their memories alone." He looked directly into the camera. "Everyone watching at home, if you have a letter in a drawer, a photograph in a wallet, a name you've never said out loud, someone loved you enough to leave something behind, honor that. Don't wait 77 years to let someone know you're carrying it. You pick up the phone tonight, and you tell someone what you've been holding." The audience rose. 212 people stood. Sachiko Kimura crossed the stage and took Dorothy May's other hand. And for a moment, the 2 grandmothers, one from Mississippi, one from Osaka, stood together holding a letter written by a 16-year-old girl to a boy who died at 18. And neither of them spoke. And neither of them needed to. The clip hit the internet on October 6, 2024. Within 4 days, it had 489 million views, the most viewed Family Feud clip in the show's history. The hashtag "Love Doesn't Run Out" trended in 54 countries. News outlets from every continent ran the story. The letter itself, 9 sentences, written in pencil, 77 years old, was displayed at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in a temporary exhibit titled "Carried," alongside the brass button from James Beaumont's father's suit jacket. The exhibit ran for 6 months and was visited by 1.2 million people. Dorothy May received her hip replacement at Emory on October 14, 2024. Dr. Hendricks performed the surgery herself. The Andre sat in the waiting room for 4 hours and counted the tiles on the floor the same way he counted his grandmother's steps. The surgery was successful. 6 weeks later, Dorothy May walked 18 steps without assistance in her physical therapy session. The therapist asked her how she felt. She said, "Like I've got somewhere to be." The Dorothy May Letters Project launched in February 2025, funded by an initial donation of $300,000 from the Harvey Foundation and a matching grant from the Department of Veterans Affairs. In its first year, the project collected and preserved 14,600 personal items: letters, photographs, medals, journals, recordings, from military families across 43 states. Each item was digitized, archived, and returned to the family with a letter from Dorothy May herself, dictated to Nia, who had volunteered to be her grandmother's scribe every Saturday morning. Steve Harvey said in an interview 3 months later, "I've met presidents, I've met billionaires, I've met the biggest stars in the world, and the most remarkable human being I have ever stood next to was a 91-pound woman in a dress she sewed in 1987, who taught me that love is not a pie. I'm going to carry that with me the rest of my life." In June 2025, Nia Johnson, Dorothy May's 15-year-old great-granddaughter, wrote an essay for her sophomore English class titled "The Letter in the Bible." The essay won a national competition. In it, she wrote about watching her grandmother unfold a piece of paper on a television stage, and how in that moment she understood that the people we love never really disappear. They just become the things we carry. Dorothy May Johnson still lives in the assisted living facility on the south side of Chicago, though she was moved to a larger room after the episode aired because the staff said she deserved a window with a view. The Andre visits every Thursday. He pushes her wheelchair to the garden, and she tells him stories about Mississippi, about Harold, about the Ford plant and the 3rd grade classroom, and the years that stacked up like hymnals on a shelf. And now, she tells him about James, the porch, the plate of food, the laugh like a screen door. She keeps the letter in her Bible, still tucked behind Psalm 23. But she doesn't carry it in her pocket anymore. She doesn't need to. The secret isn't heavy now. It's just a story. And stories are meant to be told. A 94-year-old woman in a pale blue dress she sewed herself stood at a podium on a game show stage and unfolded a letter so old the paper had turned to cloth. And in doing so, she unfolded something the whole world recognized: the simple, terrifying truth that the people we love first never leave us, and that carrying them is not a burden. It is the point. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the notification bell. Every single week, we bring you stories like Dorothy May's. Stories about people who carried something heavy and turned it into something beautiful. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe, bell, and share this with someone who's been carrying something they haven't said out loud.